So it's my pleasure today to introduce our speaker, Ken McLachlan, Professor Ken McLachlan. Ken has a long history with the University of Waterloo. He's an undergraduate here, left, did his PhD, and returned to the faculty. And Ken, I don't want to list them all, has held many different positions within both the University of Waterloo campus and also at St. Jerome's University. Now, Ken is a historian, so he acquired his knowledge of computer science a little differently than most people. What he did is he roomed with two computer scientists. One was named Jim Mitchell. Jim was one of the people who helped to build the WATFOR compiler under Wes Graham's supervision. The other person was an occasional drop-in by the name of Gus German. He was one of the other people. He was one of the team of four that built the first WATFOR compiler, the thing that put Waterloo on the map from a computer science perspective. Ken is a very distinguished historian. He's written widely on Ontario history. He's the co-author of several books about many local Ontario communities and institutions, among other things, but those are the ones that jump out at me. However, I have to confess, my favorite publications are about the University of Waterloo. He's written 3 books about that and one about St. Jerome's, because I've lived through most of that history, so I can have an appreciation of what he's written. So from that point of view, I'd like to turn the thing over to Ken and thank him for coming to speak about Wes Graham, the father of computing at the university, and a key figure in the university's history. I'm looking forward to Ken's stories. I spent almost 40 years working with Wes on various projects. And just before we end, I'd like to point out, behind you is the red room, of course, in black and white. Some of you may remember that. I'd like to point out that my cell phone has more memory in it than was housed in that whole room. Just to give you some perspective on what's happened in this field. Thanks, Ken.
Thank you. When Don asked what I wanted him to do in the introduction, I said, just make it brief, and I appreciate, thank you for doing that. His cell phone may have more memory, but my memory is lacking somewhat. I'm always a bit intimidated when I come to speak to a group of, I would have said a local audience. It's much safer talking about, in my era, Johnny MacDonald. No, it's not even, that's not even safe anymore. Wilfrid Laurier is still somewhat safe. But whenever you speak to a local audience, they often know more than you about many of the topics. And like everybody else, I'm not that wild about being corrected publicly, but if I blunder today, don't hesitate to do that. When I started work on the University of Waterloo history, that was for the 40th anniversary. And we really didn't do anything much about mathematics other than to point out that it was in the Faculty of Arts, which is my faculty. So I said, well, that's for arts and that's for mathematics. We really began at Waterloo, not in a faculty of mathematics. And Wes Graham would have been hired probably into the Faculty of Arts. He would have been, in fact. However, that's not what I'm here to talk about. I, sometime later, was looking to do something for the 50th anniversary of the university, and the president and the provost in those days, Amit Chakma and David Johnson, were procrastinating. They wanted something, but as it turned out, they wanted quite a lot, but they also didn't want to pay anything, which they never did, by the way. That's also the other half of that story for the 50th anniversary. But what I really wanted to do was to then build up some research ahead of time, and the Graham Trust very kindly funded, not me personally, but a group of my students to do interviews with all the early founders in the mathematics faculty, including Ralph Stanton, who came down for 2 days of interviews. And from that, I gathered some information, at least, which I hope to talk about today. Needless to say, much of that conversation in those days would have been about Wes Graham. I didn't know Wes, but I can tell you one last, before I start on the slides. 3 weeks ago, my original PhD thesis for the University of Toronto was republished as a book. And what I should tell you, Don Cowan was away that night for the book launch, but had he been there, I would have said, because of, and I would say today, Wes Graham and Don Cowan, my PhD thesis for the University of Toronto had a massive amount of computer research. We did a correlation, it was on an election, we did a correlation of every constituency, there were 209 in those days, in Canada, looking at religion and politics and voting patterns. And we did rural and urban and Protestant and Catholic, and it was all done through the Red Room. I hired my younger brother to come up and feed that into it. And I say today, without Wes's idea that that computer should have been available to students, and my brother was actually only a high school student on his way to Waterloo but hadn't yet come, he spent the whole summer working out of the Red Room on this project for me. And I think I today want to acknowledge that debt to Wes and his philosophy about making the computer available. At U of T, there was no computing time available for anyone, and I did my master's at Dalhousie, and it was equally bad, if not worse. I don't think they even had a computer. They were struggling to find a way to get a computer. At Waterloo, we had the largest system in Canada. So with that introduction, I'm not really qualified to do this talk today, but I wanted to say those things from my beginning. That is the picture of Wes in the Red Room, which is now in black and white, but at least we still have a picture of the Red Room. And I always kind of like that one because he's looking proudly over the computers in that room. And I think he was equally happy that that would be in black and white because I don't think he ever really approved of the red color. He wanted to change that, but they said, no, it can't be changed because, you know, that math building is so dark and all the doors are dark. They have to have some color. And they suggested they might paint the computers a different color, and Wes didn't agree with that. So we ended up with the Red Room, which has become the iconic image of Waterloo. And I was looking at photos to try to give those of you who didn't know him a sense of the humanity of this person who looms so large in the history of the University of Waterloo and in the computing department and in computer science especially. I know that there are better ones, but I kind of always liked that one, and it's one that was used extensively in promoting the University of Waterloo. And then I love this one, because that's Wes on this side, and that is Captain Kirk, Star Trek, William Faulkner. And there I thought, wonderful, they're side by side, they're talking about the Super Pet, I think it is, yeah. And I thought, I'm going to put this up at the front because it shows you the kind of reputation that Wes Graham had at Waterloo and the kind of national recognition. And when I found that ad, I said, that is really hilarious, but it's also kind of symbolically significant. So I put it at the very beginning, and then we're looking at, I won't be able to go through this entire lecture because I have so much material to give you, but there is this massive collection of papers in the university library. And Don Cowan, who has introduced me, has also donated an extensive collection of papers and photos and scrapbooks. We can actually, someone could really write a wonderfully illustrated history of computer science at Waterloo and the Faculty of Mathematics. And so I just put this up because many of you, well, I think everybody in this room actually will remember those computer cards. I finally threw mine out. My wife said, clean this study at some point. So I cleaned all the ones from my PhD thesis, which was then 40 years old. And I thought, yeah, nobody's going to be able to read the cards anyway. But I liked them. And you know, the mythology is, of course, that if you look at the Math and Computer building, the way those sides come out by all the windows, it has been alleged, although not true, that it was to represent computer cards. If you go and take a look when you walk out and you'll see it, and you'll say, is that really possible? It's possible that there's a rumor. It's not really true. That's why they're that shape. And then I was trying to think, if people hadn't been at Waterloo or coming back for alumni reunion, they ought to look at this sign, Wes Graham Way, and if I had to try to prove my argument about his significance, that's it right there. That would be it. Well, of course, it's only I just wanted to take that slide because it's, without Wes Graham and without computing and without the application of computing in a practical way, there would be no research park, so it's entirely appropriate that road sign was put up. And the company behind it, then called Sybase, no longer called that. It's one of the founding companies that took out their building for the R&T park. I think if they hadn't agreed to build there, I don't think the R&T park would have taken off either. So there's a lot of things that when you look back on, you say, oh yeah, it's always like that. It's not like that at all. It's only because of certain factors. There's the more recent name, but it'll probably be changed again, I suspect. And the other building, Open Text, wouldn't be here either without Wes Graham. I'm going to be talking about that in a few minutes. But you look at the two anchor points in the R&T park. Without Wes's ideas about licensing and technology, and Wes going off to Oxford with Doug Wright to persuade Oxford University that we had the facilities to do this. There's this wonderful image I have in my mind, and it's of Wes and Doug at Oxford striding across that campus to tell them, yes, you're going to be coming to Waterloo. Doug has all of his own enthusiasms, but Wes had all of his personality and his sense of presence, and the two of them, I think, were as important as anything in persuading Oxford to go along with Waterloo. I can push that further back and say, for all sorts of other reasons, without Wes's ideas, Oxford wouldn't have come here. And without Wes's ideas, the spin-off company called Open Text wouldn't have happened. And if we really want to debate any of these things, I'd be happy to do that. We have several hours more, except it's true, and there's not really much debate about it. That's what I try saying at home, too, and they don't believe me either. This is the one I wanted to talk about. This is the beginning of the campus. This is what it would have looked like when Wes came. And the story that I always think of is Wes's mother saying, when he left IBM to come to Waterloo, she came in tears at saying, you're not really going. Was the mother-in-law? It's a better story when it's his mother in tears at his failure, but his failure leaving IBM and a wonderful business career to come to this university in all this mud. I will amend that to say his mother-in-law or someone said that to him. Look at the campus that he came to, and you can understand why they were kind of disillusioned about what might happen at Waterloo. And then there was the famous bank building, and I've been asked several times, can you get us a picture of that bank building where Watcom originally, a lot of the research for Watcom spun off out of that building? And I said, yeah, it's there, and again, without Wes shifting that activity from the campus to here, much of the other technological stuff that occurs would not have happened. So every time you scratch the surface a little bit, Wes Graham's name appears, if not in print, at least behind the scenes for making things happen at Waterloo. And maybe that's the heading should have been, Wes Graham, the man who really made things happen at Waterloo. When I was talking to one of the IBM consultants who used to be here when Wes was in his heyday in mathematics, he said to me, the consultant did, he said, Bert Matthews, the president, used to just be fearful whenever Wes came to his office because he knew it was going to cost him money, and he knew he had no choice but to do it. And he said he tried to avoid Wes at all times because it was always going to cost him something. Good ideas often cost money. But I've often thought of that story. I could see him striding in, and I could see Bert thinking, oh, what am I going to do now? And can I get out of this? And the answer was always, not really. Thank goodness. The other part of the story that comes around, and I'm not following the logic of a chronology at all, but this is the photo that I liked because it's the photo of Wes at U of T. And in that same photo, and I tried to look it up on my little screen, the other person in the photo is Bill Davis. And we have always had this wonderful sense of the Davis Center. And why did the university name the Davis Center after Bill Davis? And it had nothing to do with the building of that building, which came in under David Peterson. It has to do with the original Math and Computer building and the willingness to fund the Math and Computer building, and especially the large computer system that was installed. And Wes said to Bill, well, you know, it's a Math and Computer building, so that should be put in under furniture. And Davis agreed. And when the other universities found out about it, they complained bitterly, and the university did have to pay back the Ontario government. Otherwise, every university would have wanted the government to provide them with computing facilities equal to ours, which were then the largest in North America, certainly the largest in Canada and one of the largest in North America. So the Davis Center that we're in today was named not because of this building, but because of what Bill Davis did with his friend Wes Graham back in the earlier 60s, 1966 probably. Again, it's not evident. When you look at it, you wouldn't see that sign. And when I got this photograph, I couldn't believe it because there the two of them are, and you can see them on the original photo, which I bet I still have at home if I didn't donate it to the university. It's probably worth money now. I better hand it back in. It's just kind of interesting because that's the story about the Davis Center that we're in. And there is a plaque out in this building about Wes's role in creating computer science at Waterloo. Anyway, that one I thought I put up because most of you wouldn't have seen that photograph, and most of you wouldn't have heard that story.
Can you point out which one's here?
I tried, and I have to confess that I failed on my laptop. Well, I blind everybody in the room by pointing it at you first. No, I tried actually, and I don't know which one it is. And I could find the names at the bottom, and I could find Bill Davis. They're not side by side, but they're all together in the class photo. Sorry.
Wes is the middle of the back.
Because of his height.
Yeah.
That's what I thought too. And Bill Davis is somewhere closer to the front because of his lack of height. Do you want to take the pointer and point it?
No, I'm just reading first row, second row. I see Davis's name right there.
Yeah. I tried today several times on my laptop, and I could not do it. And I didn't have the original. Anyway, I put in the red tie because it's a math faculty, and they like you to do that. Or the pink tie, Ralph Stanton's tie. That's the opening of the building. And there's I was looking at iconic photographs of the Red Room, and I don't have many. We don't have many, but if you go out into the foyer, there is a replica of the Red Room, and I think it's fascinating just to see it again. The story about it, the color red, though, was Peter Sprung, who was walking with Wes back from the original computing center, which was then, in those days, in the physics and mathematics building, 3rd floor. And Peter said to Wes, you know, they're going to be painting it red. And Wes said, no. And there was a huge outcry, and they went over to talk to the architect and say, you can't do that. And that's where the whole debate came about. Could you repaint the computers then to a different color and maybe make the walls different? She said, no, absolutely not. And he actually lost that debate. I'm surprised. I never knew of him losing a debate like that before. However, it became part of the iconography of the University of Waterloo. And there is the Davis Center. And what I like about this older photo is there. That's the famous water tower that was the landmark for everyone in Waterloo. And when I had this photo taken for myself, I love the fact that the water tower, on which the words beer had been painted, which almost as much as the computer drove Waterloo to international reputation, still existed, gone now, along with all the neighborhood that surrounded it. And there is Ralph Stanton, and I put Ralph's picture in a couple of places because he's the one who actually recruited Wes to come to Waterloo, or Wes wrote to Ralph. Wes had been a student of Ralph's at University of Toronto. And I'm going to tell the story to his family. You've heard the story often, I'm sure, but Wes is with IBM and rising up into a senior administrative position. He was out in British Columbia working on the big project at Kitimat. And on the flight back, the Trans-Canada Airlines flight that crashed in the Rockies, and it was the first major Canadian Airlines crash that, there have been others, but this was a major passenger plane. And Wes was scheduled to be on that flight, and there were 3 empty seats. One of those was his because he didn't make the flight. And after that, he said, I'm not interested in any more flying. I don't want to fly anymore. And he, for other reasons, I'm sure besides that, but he also wouldn't fly for a number of years after that. No matter where the conference was, he wouldn't go if he had to fly. Drive, yes, all the way to Boston or all the way to Florida, but not go by plane. Anyway, he wrote to his old friend Ralph Stanton, his professor at Toronto, and Ralph said yes. And he said, this is the real ironic part, I'd like to get out of computing. I want to teach statistics. And Ralph said, yes, we could use you teaching stats at Waterloo. Ralph, by the way, wasn't keen on computers then either. He thought a pencil was better because you could then, closer to the material, you had a better sense of it. Those computers he didn't really approve of. And so it's kind of fascinating. When Wes comes here and gets involved with computing, he said, what I really want to do is make the computer as easy to use as a pencil and paper. That's sort of taking Ralph Stanton's idea and turning it around on its head. And that, of course, was the right one, and Ralph's was the wrong one. I can say that today. He can't even come and correct me, which he used to do when I gave public lectures. Ralph did, because he had a different point of view on a number of issues, including that one. And what are they working on? Monroe calculators. In the year before the computers, that was the mathematics system for doing mathematical problems right there. And that's what Ralph rather preferred. And there is the first computer that comes in is not actually an IBM, despite the rumors at Waterloo. This one was actually a BENDIX. And before Ralph would set it up, he wanted to check things his way with a pencil on a piece of paper. And then the computer was to be programmed to do the same problems. And they got the same answers. So he was somewhat convinced that maybe it was all right after all. That comes out of Peter Ponzo's book, and I rather like that because it's the idea of Ralph and the computer. And there's the paper feed. And what's rather interesting is that the first location for computing at Waterloo was in the Department of Mathematics rather than in electrical engineering. And that really distinguishes us from most of the other universities where computer science and computing was in electrical engineering, not in mathematics. And the irony of that building was it was called Physics and Mathematics. And when the building was opened, the man who opened it said, well, finally mathematics has got its name on a building, even if it's secondary to physics. There's a lot of truth in that statement. There's a whole other story about the dominance of physics over mathematics in those early years. And I still remember, because I was here as a student, and then the computer was on the 3rd floor of the math building, or what I now call the math building. It was not in this wing, but in the other end. And then we're going to start talking about the computers that did come through, and I better watch it. This man here, Basil Myers, was the head of electrical engineering at Waterloo, and he would have been the normal head of the computing systems at Waterloo. And he got into a snit and a fight and disliked Ontario, disliked Canada, and returned to University of the United States. And they didn't have anyone in place, and Wes was elevated shortly after to take on the role of director of computing at Waterloo. $50 extra a month, I think it was. But if he hadn't done that and computing had continued to be dominated by electrical engineering, I say quite honestly, we would have had a very different kind of development as a university. So sometimes accidents of fate, whether it's airplane crashes or American professors heading home with someone in place to take it on, really moved it forward. And there we have Wes and Doug Lawson. And they're talking with Tom McCulty about the first 1620. So it's IBM at this point, and that's where Wes's range of knowledge was, and there's a whole story about why we got to this computer, which is not our first IBM, but our second, because the original one was smaller, but it could be delivered right away. There's another whole story after story about, which I get corrected on regularly. Well, not anymore, because I don't talk about this anymore, but I used to get corrected on, this was not the first computer. But what I wanted to say is the fact that IBM itself started talking about the University of Waterloo and making computing available, and if you were to read the fine print, it says in all faculties for graduates, undergraduates, as well as professors. It's amazing. That's an amazing shift, I tell you. You're locked out of them unless you're a senior professor at U of T in those days. Not even a junior prof would get it. Not here. With Wes's ideas, it's being used in every faculty, including arts. And that's, I think, a real transition as well. And I rather like watching the evolution of the computing system and its director as well. And I put this one in on purpose. It's out of my book on the university because it's Wes with students. And so often we think of Wes with machinery, but Wes's commitment was also to students and making the computer available and accessible to students. That's a hallmark of Waterloo. And I thought there's an image that actually shows that. His kind of enthusiasm and the students, I recognize them because that was from my period when I was an undergraduate. So I know that they were not all in mathematics, which was still, by the way, in the Faculty of Arts. And the next big thing that changed things was the use of the computer science days. Don Cowan, who's sitting here, will tell you that he was dragged in by Wes to do this without a choice on the weekends, and his wife, Marg, whom we all knew in the earlier days, was not happy that she was home on Saturdays, every Saturday, and Don is down here running these computer science days. Well, what a dramatic change it was, because this became, once we were in the Red Room, a tourist attraction for Waterloo, the like of which we've probably not seen since then, including my family and their friends all came up to look at this. And again, taking both Don and Wes together, they're writing programs which will allow students in one day to learn how to write a program to use the computer. Something I probably never mastered, but some of them clearly did. And I guess you notice the gender. They're all young women. What? This is science and mathematics? Unbelievable. And there's himself. That's Don at that time as a younger director of computing. I said, I like watching the photos because of the hairline changes. But Don said, oh, you mean the wrinkles? I said, no, the hairline. I was fascinated by it. I've gone one step too far. Oh, I was just talking about the evolution of computing. I want to pick up this one. Again, this is really significant. The 3 students solving the Archimedes cattle problem, I mean. That alone, that students were allowed to get in, they had to come in the evenings to link these 2 computers together to make that solution possible. But you know what happened? Wes decided that this was something that was so significant that it made news all over North America. Again, it's undergraduate students. It's not senior professors doing that. And it gives the Waterloo the sense of it being a young university, a university that's really going places as opposed to stodgy, older. I don't know why I say that at my age, but that's what I thought anyway. It's just they brought international acclaim, and that's one of the things that. And the other one is the story about the Forgo interpreter, not a compiler, from the University of Wisconsin. And you probably have heard this story, but I will tell my version of it, because one of those students, Wes and Ralph Stanton, took along a young student by the name of Gus German. And Gus tells this story wonderfully well. Well, he managed to pirate a version of the Forgo interpreter back to Waterloo, although he doesn't know how it happened or how it got in his coat or anything to do with that. But he said the drive up there was terrible because he'd been out the night before and had a terrible hangover. And it was Wes who came in and roasted him out of bed, dragged him out, stuck him in the car. And he said Wes had a new car, and he and Ralph Stanton, he wouldn't go over the speed limit, which I think was only 50. And they drove all that way, and Wes and Ralph were talking. He said, all the way, talk. And he said, I'm feeling so hungover. And I could not believe that they would only go 50 miles an hour, and I sat in the back seat. So when I got to Wisconsin, I jumped out of the car. I'm sure he jumped out of the car. That part is probably true. And he found the famous Forgo interpreter in their computing center, where he was just sort of walking around, wandering around, as he did. And somehow got in his coat, and he brought it back. And when he got back, Wes was terribly embarrassed because he then had to phone the university and say, we've unfortunately somehow managed to get this interpreter with us. They said, oh, go ahead and use it, basically. And that would become the basis for the famous WATFOR compiler. That story is equally a Wes Graham story, which, given that I can have the audience, I can tell that story because his family are here and they probably know these versions of it. But as Don said, I pushed the wrong one. Jim Mitchell, who was sitting here, lived in residence with me, and Gus, who used to visit on the weekends, didn't have a room, but he used to come there and sleep there and eat there anyway. And so the story came through from Jim Mitchell about how they used to play on the computer when it was still in the math and the physics and mathematics building. Gus apparently had a master key to all the buildings in the university. Or they used to pop the tile and climb over and then down and get inside. And they were all working in there playing with the computer, making music, making sounds. And Wes came in and scared the life out of them and said, what are you guys doing? And they said, well, we're so keen on computing, we've taught ourselves how to program. We've gone and bought the book, we've done it all ourselves. This is about 1964 when the first confrontation took place. And in the summer, Wes got them a classroom and put the 4 of them together, and they converted what was in the Forgo interpreter into the WATFOR compiler. And they were just locked in the classroom. Gus German disappeared part of the summer, and Wes had to go and get him. He was hiding out someplace. He just wasn't that interested in doing that, and they dragged him back. I think he was working on his Austin Healey. That's the truth. And he was more interested in that than this. But anyway, they then took them into Toronto to IBM. Wes took them in and said, we're going to show you our interpreter, our compiler, and compare it to yours. And they ran the program, and Jim Mitchell tells me the story with sound effects, saying that the IBM one went boop, and then bloop, and then boop, and they put the FORTRAN compiler in, and it went brrrp, and done. And they couldn't believe it. But that became the thing that really revolutionized the idea. And the number of universities that wanted to borrow it or rent it or use it, and that's when the possibility of then, Peter Sprung told me, he said that they were just, the phone is ringing off the hook, and Wes said, well, they can use it. All they have to do is send their own tape, and we'll copy it and give it back. They're talking about those little tapes, like a tape deck. I had some pictures of it if we go right at the very end. And long story short is, they were overwhelmed by the number of universities that wanted to use it. And then they said, well, we'll have to charge a fee, especially when they would find there were still errors in it. And if we were going to correct the errors, you have to pay a fee, and there's a whole system of building in expenses, but it began the separate series of money that would come into computer science through separate from the university for the work with the compilers, the WATFOR, and then the next version up. I think it's really fascinating because he put those guys in that classroom. They were undergraduates. They're just really enthusiastic about computing. And that's part of the story about Wes being able to tap into younger, well, all younger in those days, but undergraduates, and give them this assignment. And they told me, I think what they were paid. Was it $5,000 for the summer? I think so. Jim Mitchell told me what it was. I'm not quite sure. Ian, is that too much?
What I got paid per year when I started.
Well, you know, they pay you what you're worth. I mean, you can't pay everybody at that high level. No, Jim did tell me, so I've got it in my notes someplace, what they actually were paid for the summer for doing that. It was a bargain anyway.
I think I got paid $8,000 per year when I graduated in '73, working on WATFOR.
Well, then it wouldn't have been that much for those guys then.
Yeah, because they would be several years earlier, so.
Yeah.
Might have been 500.
Yeah, I think 500 was
Anybody who really wants to know, send an email to Don Common and he'll check it out for you and send it back. There's Peter Sprung, and Peter was talking about how the origin of licensing comes up. Okay, so just take for the precedent for a minute. So they decide they're going to license these terms. So when you have a company like OpenText, they have a licensing agreement. When you have a company like MapleSoft, they have a licensing agreement. All these things originally come through Wes and Peter Sprung's office, and they then get amended over time. But that's where that idea comes, ownership of intellectual property first, and then the licensing agreement. And that's what made this university stand out among all the others, because faculty would own the intellectual property that they created, and also the university would provide a licensing agreement, which is what Peter Sprung did. And he's got lots of stories about his relationship with Wes and how they organized all this. I just think it's fascinating because when I said you can link OpenText and Whatcom and MapleSoft, there's a Wes Graham link in each of these. And if you ask Keith Geddes about MapleSoft, he said, yeah, without Wes, it wouldn't have happened. He had created an environment in which it was right to do this sort of thing. Scholars could also do this. In a more pure-based university, it wouldn't have been acceptable for that kind of scholarship to exist. That's Keith telling me that about MapleSoft, but it would be the same story with Frank Tompa about OpenText, but why they took the Oxford project on. So when you think of a title for the talk today and think Wes Graham and Father of Computing, I'm not sure that that's an adequate title. I think the Father of Computing's ideas spun off into so many other directions that his role, the Wes Graham way, is probably understated what the university should have put up as a sign. There is the famous textbook for the next version of IBM. That's the one that really put Waterloo on the international reputation. The textbook alone had 500,000, I got 250,000 in excess of. One time I asked Paul Dirksen if he had the royalty statements. Oh yeah, he said, I've got them. So I could figure out how many they actually sold. He had a box of these statements for, well, he gave me the box and said, here, figure it out. And 250,000 was probably a modest statement of what that book sold. It was probably Prentice Hall's best-selling book in in a long time. And it also made Waterloo well known so that senior scholars are attracted to come to Waterloo because of this textbook and because of this program. So in my own research on other scholars who came here, they said, we said, well, where is Waterloo? And they said, well, I don't really know where it is, but I know about the program that they're running. And that program did a huge amount to create the international reputation. And I just put Deputy Dirk up there, Paul Dirksen, up because of his role along with Wes in developing computing. That's the pictures from a computer magazine. I mean, we're building a reputation internationally. And I was looking at just some documents that all of you probably understand about the debugging aspect of it. What I liked about it was the fact that in these programs, you could also find your errors and correct them as opposed to having to wait for a week for the turnaround. Those of us who type regularly and type badly still find our errors instantly still, unless you use a BlackBerry, which creates errors for you all the time because it thinks it knows how to spell better what you're trying to spell. I'd like to have something to go back and correct it, but that's a different story. There's Don. We now have to do something that links the beginning of a computer systems group in 1973 with the Department of Computer Science. And in this, I think we have to make sure we understand the difference between what the Computer Systems Group was doing in developing the reputation and what the Department of Computer Science was doing at a time when computer science was unknown. Most universities were hesitant about something called computer science. They were not too sure about computers and what that had to do with academics, and they weren't sure that it was a science. And Don sitting here is the bridge between those two concepts and making that work for Waterloo. But who do you think appointed him to both of those positions? Wes Graham. Because Ralph Stanton's gone now. It's Wes Graham who's pulling the strings and saying, Don, I want you to do this, and Don, could you set this up? And that's why I think it's important to make those links and those distinctions as well. They were looking at, George Hill. Looking at the keyboard, is that what you're calling it? Console. The keyboard, console. Computer, they're all sort of vaguely the same thing to me, but I wanted it just because of the size and scale of it. And the second picture of the same thing, and that's what's out in the mock-up out in the front. You can go take a look at it. And then we're looking at the key punch room. I was thinking I'll put these up just because people here will remember how these things looked and how they worked, and I don't, but I thought they're significant things that the size and scale of computer science at Waterloo, and the debugging terminal, and the cards. And then I was looking at rippers and wrappers and the stories about, I think the text was, it challenged Wes's ingenuity to make it possible for students to run their own programs. And the rippers and wrappers was one of the original solutions to that difficulty. And you're not letting them run with their elastics into the system, which would then plug up the computer. So there's a whole reason for doing this besides students' enthusiasm. But what I liked about it is, linking it to Wes at least, is it's his ingenuity for how can you make sure that students can access computing. And this solution was kind of ingenious at the time. And then you notice they're all students lining up to run their programs. And then I was looking at looking at photos to bring the people together. Paul Dirksen and then Wes, and of course Peter Sprung is at the end. And I'm not going to try to remember the names. Jim Dodd, Sandra Hope, and George Hill. See, there you go. It's all in my text, by the way. If we had a text, I would have been able to read them, but I'm doing this ad-libbing it. And there we are linked together in the red room. And this always struck me as both kind of a poignant and a kind of a sad moment is the unplugging of the IBM 36075 with Burt Matthews and Paul Dirksen and Wes. That was a real historic moment at this university when that is unplugged, and then the Red Room, as we all knew it and loved it and looked and brought people to admire it, has no purpose. That's a dramatic, I'm waving my finger, that's a dramatic moment, it is. The other thing that I thought about Wes, and one of the things that struck me that I ought to say today was that his idea about using shared conferences to get ideas out that were being developed at Waterloo was really significant. So instead of trying to hide it and keep it just for ourselves, he really believed in moving these ideas into the larger sense and participating in that. And I got into arguments about this from time to time when we talk about copyright. How are ideas copyrighted, and was copyright a big issue in those days? And my sense is that it wasn't, not as it has become. And the idea, and this is an earlier era when computing and computer science is still very much evolving, and people are wanting to share the ideas rather than to try to limit it and hold it just for themselves. I don't think they hadn't thought much about the kind of money gain that could be made from all this. I'm not sure of any of that, except that I'm sure that the idea of sharing the ideas was part of his philosophy, and it became significant at Waterloo as well. Now, this is my favorite story. This is the big truckload of computers from digital equipment arriving at Waterloo, and the picture of Doug Wright unloading the truckload. And I'm not sure how many of you know the story, but it's been verified for me on several different occasions. When DEC was making this major donation to Waterloo, there was a footnote attached to it, a codicil on the donation, which is that any intellectual property created from these machines from DEC would be retained by DEC, not by the professors or not by those who created them. And as the story was told by several who witnessed it, when the truck was loaded, Wes actually phoned DEC and said, "Stop the trucks." I'm not sure they were on the highway yet, but they were certainly loaded. He said, do not bring those here, stop the trucks. And that's an amazing, gutsy kind of move, but it was consistent with the idea that the Waterloo story and the ideas about licensing and intellectual property took precedence. And DEC backed down, and the computers came here. I've always loved the story of him shouting into the phone, "Stop the trucks," and I'm not sure that there wasn't an expletive somewhere in that phrase. I think it was me, there would have been, so I'm not sure that he was better mannered in that sense than I would have been. But he certainly was strong-willed and determined, and they did. And without that, you can be sure that, because the big machines, the VAXs that came, without that we could not have had Maple. We could not have had MapleSoft, would not have happened, nor would the open text have happened without that donation of equipment. It just wasn't going to happen, because Keith was telling me in those days he was phoning friends at MIT in Boston, trying to get that kind of computing system for the projects they were running. And so without that, and you couldn't keep doing that. So it's the style and the attitude and the looking into the future, and Doug smiling away said, "Oh, it's fine with me. We've got the computers, that's what I want." Don?
I was just going to say one footnote. That was $35 million worth of equipment.
$35 million in those days. I don't know what if you converted that today, but
$35 million retail. I worked at that at the time. Retail is different than tractor price, but yeah, retail, $35 million.
so convert that into our dollars today. What do you think it would be retail?
This is 84. That's about 30 years ago. Probably about 100.
Yeah, it was a gutsy thing no matter how you look at it, for him to have said that. And DEC was keen to continue the relationship with Waterloo in any case, and that relationship with DEC was absolutely critical for the future development here. So it's one of those wonderful moments of something that really changed the direction again. Had he not done it, the computers might have come, but the direction may not have worked. And I know that Keith Getty certainly talked to me, and so did Frank Tompa, about the need for the kind of philosophy that we had here, and the recognition that that was significant. And the licensing as well, all that was part of it. And it moved us into 1984. So it moved us into a whole other era of computing and development of computing beyond the Red Room. And the opening of the Oxford English Dictionary, and then the dictionary, the photograph and the style of it. And where can I find it? It's in the Wesley Graham papers, naturally. So when you're a historian looking for evidence to try to recreate some of this, all that, I think could be said that Wes didn't ever throw in any papers either. So if you go to his papers, there's a lot of good information in there that you mightn't expect to find. And then I was picking up the Maple Agreement. When there was a story broke about Wes Graham's role in Maple, and it was in the University Gazette, or the Bulletin as it's now called. And they said, no, Wes Graham had nothing to do with that, absolutely nothing to do with it. And Keith Geddes, who was the professor along with Gaston Gonnet, wrote in immediately and said, absolutely wrong, without Wes Graham, it wouldn't have happened. That's where I'm getting some of that evidence from. I then phoned Keith and said, well, can you tell me more about why and how that happened? But I just put that in because the Maple presence on the campus was pretty dominant. And that, of course, is the famous Gus German, an animated conversation with Wes. Gus did come back. We have a wonderful tape interview. It was taped too, not but recorded, of Gus talking about his experiences with Wes and the original Forgo interpreter and the master key that he had to all the buildings and all the other things that went on in the early mid-60s to early 70s. And then if we were going to keep going, and we can keep going, but I'm going to watch the clock because I don't want to overdo my time, it's the idea of developing not just the mainframe, which is a thing that people think about, but they also ought to be thinking about Wes's role in creating this whole campus-wide system of what were then called portable computers. And without that, I mean, that leads through to the laptop computers of today, but that's way ahead of its time again. That's where the networks are being created across campus. And that's Don Cowan again, looking at an early system. And I'm just going to flip through it. And the network, and why that network was significant. I think in the history of the University of Waterloo, we haven't really paid enough attention to these kinds of internal things that really pushed our students when they go out on co-op jobs to be much more job ready and experienced. When I've interviewed employers, they said, that's one of the real advantages of students coming out of Waterloo is not just the theory of computer science, but the fact they had this kind of practical experience and knew how to apply it. I'll tell you one other part of that same story, because one of the businessmen who employed a lot of Waterloo students, a man called George Fearheller, who had a major company out of Toronto, and I talked to George about students, and he actually knew Wes at IBM. They had a long-standing connection because they were both at IBM at the same time. George said the thing about students coming out from Wes's program and Wes's students is that they always were the same as they were right on top of the field. But he said, they used to say to me, why are you doing it that way? And George said, they're right, why are we doing it that way? And he said, that's the really outstanding thing about dealing with Wes and Wes's students is they would challenge you in the right way to improve the way your systems were working. And I think all this comes out from these subsequent sets of images. And I'm running out of time, so I'll just flip my way through the highlights that I'd pulled without trying to explain it. Computer graphics division, and there's another one where they're writing text. And then the various programs coming out of, Ian, that's coming out of Watcom, right? Yeah. I think the thing is, it's just the kind of reputation that Waterloo has created. Think of any of the other faculties in Waterloo, and you find it really difficult to match the kind of international, national reputation that is created by this development of these programs. I thought if I'm doing this for alumni, most of you will remember some of this, so I'm just going through it without trying to prod you. Remember this? Frank Tompa and Gaston Gonnet with open text. Wonderful stories about them and trying to work on Wes's system and trying to use the same licensing agreement, which ultimately had to change and didn't work for them. But the idea of a philosophy of doing it is what was really significant. And back to the classroom with all the computers set up for Maple, and the microcomputers and the pets. And that's where that ad originally with Captain Kirk came. That's George Vierheller. And the Volker Craig system set up and... What? Wait a minute, who was that young guy? Did I see that young guy there smiling? Yeah, are you handing money over as well? That's an unusual picture. It's Ian McPhee handing money over to Doug Wright. Doug Wright is usually picking your pocket, but not you're not smiling quite the same way. I think that is a check, isn't it, Ian? For sure, for real, isn't it?
Yeah, I think we were one of the chartered corporate partners of the Institute for Computer
Yeah,
Research.
ICR.
$250,000 check.
Yeah,
For an early stage company, that was significant.
that's right. I'm now talking about spin-off companies coming out of, as a major development from Wes Graham's influence, and then Mike and Ophelia Lazaridis creating their own spin-off company, and then pushing for another kind of computing. And I was looking for a conclusion, and I said, the end is just the beginning at Waterloo. So all those projects and all those ideas and all that push is really beginning all over again. It hasn't just ended suddenly, it's just changing its direction. And I think if you were to say, well, why? I think the answer would be, a lot of the answer is going to be Wes Graham. Thank you for that attention and those corrections.